All right, fight fans, welcome to the very first episode of the MMA Scholar Podcast.
The MMA Scholar Podcast.
You heard right. Get ready to trade your tap-out shirts for tweed jackets, because we're about to get academic up in here.
Academic about MMA.
Yeah. We're going to be exploring the crazy world of MMA through, well, actual research.
Research.
Yep. Scholarly articles, peer-reviewed journals, the real deal. We're not just going to be, rehashing hot takes from Joe Giggins' podcast here.
Well, that's a relief.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. Sometimes the MMA world can feel like a Jerry Springer episode, But guess what? There are actual economists and real scholars out there studying this stuff.
Whoa.
Seriously, it's wild.
I mean, I guess it makes sense, right? MMA is a huge industry.
Exactly. So I'm your host for this brainy beatdown.
And I'm the resident expert, I guess you could say.
That's right. The brains of the operation. So, if you ever wondered why everyone seems obsessed with the heavyweight division.
I mean, bigger is better, right?
Yeah, that's what everyone thinks. But is it really true? Is there something else going on?
Interesting question.
It is. And guess what? Researchers have actually looked into this. There's this one study we'll be talking about today, and it's found that, well, get this, welterweight bouts actually tend to draw more viewers than heavyweight fights.
Seriously? Welterweight, that's surprising.
I know, right? It kind of blows the whole bigger is better thing out of the water.
It definitely challenges the conventional wisdom.
It does. So we're already debunking myths on day one. I love it.
We aim to please.
And speaking of unexpected findings, we'll also be looking at research on the rise of women's MMA.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating topic.
It is. Think about Ronda Rousey. She totally changed the game.
Absolutely. She was a force of nature.
It's amazing how one fighter can have such a huge impact on an entire sport,
It's remarkable. And her influence extends beyond the octagon, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We'll be looking at studies that examine her impact on, pay-per-view buys and the overall perception of female fighters.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that. How much did she really contribute to the growth of women's MMA?
Well, the research suggests that her contribution was significant, but it also raises important questions about, how the UFC markets its female athletes.
Ooh, now that's interesting. Is it about genuine athletic achievement, or are they, playing into stereotypes to attract viewers?
That's a question we'll be grappling with today. And it's just one example of the complex issues that this research brings to light.
This is getting good. So we've got weight class dynamics, the rise of women's MMA, maybe even some UFC marketing conspiracies. What else is on the menu for today's deep dive?
Well, we can't forget about the economics of fighter pay.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot button issue.
It is a hot button issue, and the research provides some fascinating insights.
Yeah, it's crazy how much money the UFC makes.
It is.
But you always hear about fighters struggling to make ends meet.
It's a complex issue for sure.
So today we're going to be examining studies that attempt to quantify the marginal revenue product of UFC fighters.
You mean how much each fighter contributes to the UFC's bottom line?
Exactly. How much money does Conor McGregor bring in versus, a lesser-known fighter?
Precisely. And what's interesting is that some research suggests that the marginal revenue product of all UFC fighters is essentially zero.
Wait, zero? Seriously? That can't be right.
Well, it's more complicated than that.
I mean, how can the UFC be making billions if the fighters aren't contributing anything?
Right. It's a great question, and it highlights the complexities of this issue.
For sure. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a roller coaster.
A very apt analogy.
So we've got fighter pay on the docket. What else should our listeners be prepared for?
Well, we'll also be delving into the legal battles that have rocked the UFC in recent years.
Oh, you mean the Zuffa class action lawsuit?
That's the one. That's the one. It's a landmark case that could have major implications for the future of the sport.
Yeah, that's the one where fighters accuse the UFC of being a monopoly, right?
Exactly. And the research we'll be discussing today provides some valuable context for understanding the legal arguments being made.
Okay, so we've got economics, fighter pay, legal drama.
Yeah.
This is shaping out to be one heck of a deep dive.
It is indeed.
And we want to hear from you.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
What are your burning questions about, the business side of MMA? Hit us up in the comments with your thoughts. We might even tackle your questions in a future episode.
If they're scholarly enough, of course.
You heard the expert, folks. We're looking for those brainy MMA inquiries.
So buckle up, folks. Get ready for an intellectual beatdown.
Let's do this. First up, we're tackling that study on pay-per-view demand. and the surprising role of weight classes. Get ready for some myth-busting action.
Okay, so this study from Skidmore College.
Skidmore College. Never heard of it.
Well, they did some interesting research on this.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So they analyzed years of pay-per-view data.
Years of data. Wow, they really went all out.
They did. And they found that welterweight bouts actually had the strongest correlation with overall buy rates.
Welterweight? Seriously, that's wild.
I know, right? It's not what most people would expect.
So what's the explanation? Why are welterweight fights so popular?
Well, the study suggests that it might have to do with the perceived excitement level of the fights. You know, welterweight fighters are often known for their speed, agility, and technical skill.
Yeah, they're like little ninjas.
Yeah, exactly. And that can lead to, more dynamic and unpredictable bouts.
Okay, that makes sense. You're more likely to see a fast-paced, back-and-forth battle in a welterweight fight than a slow, plodding heavyweight slugfest.
Precisely. And the study also found that, certain individual fighters, especially those with star power, can drive demand regardless of weight class.
Oh, yeah, like Conor McGregor. That dude could sell ice to an Eskimo.
He's a master of self-promotion, that's for sure.
So star power matters, even in a sport that's supposed to be all about, fighting.
It seems so. Fans connect with personalities, with stories.
Right. They want to see the drama unfold.
Exactly. The human element is a crucial part of the appeal.
I'm curious about something. The study mentions using Google Trends data as a way to measure overall interest in the UFC. Why would they do that? Isn't pay-per-view data enough?
That's a great question. They used Google Trends data to try and capture the interest of fans who might be watching events through, shall we say, alternative means.
You mean those less than legal streaming sites that we're not supposed to talk about?
Exactly. It's a way to get a more complete picture of UFC viewership.
Makes sense. So what did the Google Trends data reveal? Anything surprising?
Well, it actually supported the findings from the pay-per-view data.
Oh, really? So it's consistent?
Very much so. Searches for UFC spiked when certain weight classes were featured, notably lightweight and welterweight, indicating, a strong online following for those divisions.
So we're seeing a consistent pattern here. Lighter weight classes are, like, holding their own against the heavy hitters.
Indeed. And that's a valuable insight for the UFC.
Yeah, for sure. It's not just about the big guys.
Right. There's a whole world of exciting matchups and compelling storylines in those other divisions.
Absolutely. And speaking of lighter weight classes, the Google Trends data also showed a significant bump in searches for UFC when women's bantamweight fights were on the card.
Ronda Rousey, no doubt.
Right. She dominated that division for a while.
She did. The study couldn't isolate her impact completely.
Sure.
But it's safe to say that she played a role in boosting the visibility of women's MMA.
It's crazy how one fighter can shift the entire conversation around a sport.
It is remarkable. But speaking of shifting conversations, let's move on to a topic that's been generating a lot of debate.
Hit me with it.
Fighter pay.
Okay, let's talk money. Because it's no secret that the UFC makes a lot of it.
They do.
But how much of that wealth is actually trickling down to the fighters themselves?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that researchers have been trying to answer.
It's a tough one for sure.
It is. One study we'll be discussing today attempted to calculate the marginal revenue product of UFC fighters.
Okay, remind me again. What exactly does that mean?
It's basically a way of measuring how much each fighter contributes to the UFC's overall revenue.
So, like, how much money does Conor McGregor bring in versus a lesser-known fighter?
Exactly. But here's the kicker.
Okay, I'm listening.
The study concluded that the marginal revenue product of all UFC fighters was essentially zero.
Wait, zero? Hold up. That can't be right.
I know. It's a controversial finding.
If fighters aren't bringing in any money, how is the UFC making billions?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debate about the methodology of that study.
So basically we're saying that figuring out fighter pay is like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded.
It's definitely a challenging puzzle.
But hey, that's why we're here,
Yeah.
to break it down and make it accessible.
We're here to shed some light on this complex issue.
I love it. So we've got fighter pay on the docket. What else should our listeners be prepared for?
Well, we'll also be delving into the Zuffa class action lawsuit.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. It alleges that the UFC is acting as a monopoly and exploiting its fighters.
So they're basically saying that the UFC has all the power and the fighters have very little leverage.
That's the gist of it.
It's a David and Goliath battle, for sure.
It is.
But hey, before we get too deep into the legal weeds, maybe we should circle back to those studies on UFC marketing and social media.
Oh yeah. That's a fascinating area.
I'm curious to know how they use those platforms to, like, promote fights and build hype.
Well, there's some really interesting research on that.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into the world of social media. What have they found?
Well, one study we'll be discussing today surveyed UFC fans
Okay.
to understand how they use social media.
Makes sense. So what did they find?
What they found was quite surprising.
Oh, really? Spill the tea.
Well, the study revealed that many fans are actually using social media as a substitute for watching the fights themselves.
Wait, seriously, so they're like getting their fix online without paying for the actual event?
Exactly. They're getting their fix of highlights, trash talk, behind-the-scenes content, all that good stuff.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, it's like they're getting a taste of the action for free.
Right. Which could potentially impact the UFC's pay-per-view revenue.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's got to be a concern for them.
It is. It's a double-edged sword for the UFC.
So how do they strike that balance? How do they, like, engage fans online while still driving those pay-per-view sales?
Well, one approach is to use social media strategically to create exclusive content.
Ooh, I like that. Like, give people a taste of what they're missing if they don't, shell out for the full event.
Precisely. Make it feel like you're getting access to something special.
It's like a VIP pass to the world of UFC.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of personalization.
Oh, yeah, that's huge these days.
It is. The UFC could use social media to connect with fans on a more individual level.
Tailoring content to their specific interests.
Exactly. It's all about making fans feel like they're part of the action, part of the community.
That's smart. But speaking of the UFC's social media strategy, there's this study that analyzes their posts across platforms like Instagram and Twitter. What can you tell us about that?
Well, a lot of their content is pretty standard stuff, fight announcements, promotional videos, highlights from past events.
The usual suspect.
Right. But what's interesting is that they're also using social media to build up the personalities of their fighters.
Oh, like humanizing them,
Yeah.
making them relatable.
Exactly. They're sharing personal stories, behind the scenes glimpses into their training camps, even their thoughts and feelings about upcoming fights.
So they're trying to turn them into, like, characters in a larger story.
Precisely. Which goes back to what we were saying earlier about the importance of star power.
Right. It's all connected.
It is, and it seems to be working.
Yeah, the UFC has a massive following on social media.
They do, but the question remains, is all this social media buzz translating into pay-per-view buys?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. And unfortunately, this particular study doesn't have a definitive answer.
A tough one to measure.
It is. But it's clear that the UFC is taking social media seriously.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They're not messing around.
And speaking of the UFC's their position in the market, let's circle back to that Zuffa lawsuit.
Oh, yeah, the big one.
The big one. Remember, that's the one where fighters are alleging that the UFC is operating as a monopoly.
Right, right. So to recap, the fighters are claiming that the UFC has engaged in anti-competitive practices. Anti-competitive practices, like what?
Well, like acquiring rival promotions.
So they're like eliminating the competition.
Exactly, and locking fighters into exclusive contracts.
So the fighters can't fight for anyone else.
Right, and even controlling the media narrative around the sport.
Wow, that's a lot of control.
It is, and the fighters argue that this lack of competition gives the UFC too much leverage in negotiations.
So they can basically dictate fighter pay and other terms.
Essentially, yes. And what about this whole media control thing? How is the UFC supposedly manipulating the media?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Well, the fighters allege that the UFC has used its influence to shape the way MMA is covered in the press.
Interesting. So they're trying to control the narrative.
Right. They claim that the UFC often downplays the risks involved in the sport.
Oh, so they're like making it seem safer than it actually is.
That's what the fighters are alleging.
It's pretty messed up if it's true.
It's a serious accusation for sure.
What's the latest on this case? Is it headed to trial?
Yes, the trial is scheduled for April 8th, 2024.
April 2024. That's not too far away. It'll
Yeah.
be interesting to see how this all plays out.
It will. It could be a watershed moment for the sport of MMA.
For sure. If the fighters win, it could lead to like some major changes.
It could. It could fundamentally change the way the UFC operates.
And if the UFC wins, what then?
Well, it would be a major setback for the fighters.
It would be a blow to their efforts to gain more control, for sure.
It would. But even if they lose, this lawsuit has already raised important questions.
So the UFC's business practices.
Exactly. And the need for greater transparency and fairness in the sport.
Sometimes just starting the conversation is a victory in itself.
That's a good point.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about weight classes, the rise of women's MMA, fighter pay, social media, this massive lawsuit that could shake up the entire sport.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. But I think we need to take a short break.
A short break. Okay.
Yeah, before we delve into some potential solutions for the issues we've discussed.
Sounds good to me.
We'll be right back after a quick breather. Don't go anywhere.
We'll be right back. So, welcome back to the MMA Scholar podcast. We're taking a deep dive into the business side of MMA.
We've covered a lot of ground already,
Yeah.
but there's still so much to unpack.
That's right. Before the break, we were talking about some of the major challenges facing the sport: fighter pay, the UFC's market dominance. It's complex stuff.
It is. But you mentioned some potential solutions that have been proposed. I'm really interested to hear more about those.
One idea that's often discussed is extending the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act to cover MMA fighters.
I remember us touching upon that earlier. What exactly does the Ali Act do again?
Well, the Ali Act was passed in 2000 to protect the rights of professional boxers. It aims to prevent exploitative contracts and conflicts of interest between promoters, managers, and fighters.
So it's all about like leveling the playing field and giving boxers more control over their careers.
That's the gist of it. And many people believe that applying this act to MMA would offer similar protections to UFC fighters.
It seems like a no-brainer. Why hasn't it happened already?
Well, there has been pushback from the UFC and other stakeholders. They argue that MMA is different from boxing, and the Ali Act wouldn't be appropriate or relevant.
That sounds like a convenient excuse to me. Like they're just trying to protect their own interests and maintain the status quo.
It's certainly a point of contention, but the conversation is ongoing. There's a growing movement to push for the Ali Act's expansion to include MMA.
Fingers crossed they succeed. It would be a major win for the fighters and the sport overall. Another solution we talked about earlier was the formation of a UFC fighters union.
Yeah, that's a big one. Imagine UFC fighters with the collective bargaining power of athletes in the NBA or the NFL.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah.
A union could negotiate for better pay, healthcare, retirement benefits, all the things that professional athletes and other major sports leagues take for granted.
It could potentially change the landscape of MMA.
So why hasn't it happened yet? It seems like fighters would be all over that.
Well, there are a few hurdles. One of the biggest is the legal classification of fighters as independent contractors as opposed to employees. This distinction has huge implications for their rights and ability to organize.
Right, because if they were considered employees, they would be entitled to all sorts of labor protections and benefits.
Exactly. And there's also the challenge of uniting a diverse group of athletes from all over the world, many of whom are competing against each other.
Yeah, it's like herding cats, I imagine. Everyone's got their own individual goals and ambitions.
It's not an easy task to get everyone on the same page and working towards a common goal.
But if they could put aside their differences and come together as a collective force, it would be a game changer.
There's strength in numbers, and a fighters union could leverage that strength to negotiate a better deal for everyone involved.
We've got the I Act and a fighters union. Those are two pretty big potential solutions. What else is on the table? Are there any other Any other ideas being floated around?
Well, there's also been talk of creating a UFC Fighters Council.
What would that look like?
The idea is to give fighters a voice in the decision-making process without the complexities of forming a traditional union. Think of it as a platform for dialogue and collaboration between fighters and the UFC.
So it's like a more informal way for fighters to have a seat at the table and advocate for their interests.
Exactly. It wouldn't have the
Yeah.
same legal power as a union, but it could still be an effective way for fighters to make their voices heard.
I like that idea. It's all about creating more open and transparent system where fighters feel like they have a say in their own destinies.
And it could potentially lead to a more equitable and sustainable relationship between the UFC and its athletes, which would benefit the sport as a whole.
It's definitely a step in the right direction. We've been focusing a lot on the potential legal and structural changes that could benefit fighters. But what about the UFC itself? Are they open to any of these ideas? Are they willing to make changes?
Well, their public statements suggest that they believe the current system is fair, and they're resistant to any major
Which
overhauls.
is understandable, I guess. They're a business and they're in the business of making money. But at what point does the pursuit of profit cross the line into exploitation?
That's the ethical question that looms over all of this,
Uh,
and it's one that the Zoof lawsuit is forcing us to confront.
Speaking of the Zuffa lawsuit, I'm curious about some of the specific allegations being made by the fighters. We talked about their claims of the UFC being a monopoly, but what else are they arguing?
Well, one of their key arguments is that the UFC has used its market power to suppress fighter pay.
You talked about that a bit earlier, but how exactly do they claim this is happening?
They allege that the UFC's control over fighter contracts, combined with its dominance in the market, gives them an unfair advantage in negotiations.
So fighters essentially have no choice but to accept the terms offered by the UFC, even if those terms are far below what they would earn in a truly competitive market.
That's the essence of their argument. They're saying that the UFC's business practices have created an environment where fighters are systematically underpaid.
So if the fighters win this lawsuit, it could have a massive ripple effect on the entire sport.
It could fundamentally change the way fighters are compensated.
It's a fascinating case. It really shines a light on the complex dynamics of power, money, and competition in the world of MMA.
It's a reminder that even in a sport as brutal and physical as MMA, the business side of things plays a huge role.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the problems, the fighter pay issues, the UFC's market dominance, this massive lawsuit. It's a lot to digest.
It is, but let's try to shift gears a bit and focus on some potential solutions. Some reasons for optimism.
Yes, please. I need a little hope after all that doom and gloom. What's the good news?
Well, one positive development is the growing awareness of these issues. More and more people are talking about about fighter pay, the need for reform, and the importance of treating athletes fairly.
It feels like the conversation is finally starting to shift.
It is,
Yeah.
and that's a crucial first step. Once people are aware of a problem, they can start working towards solutions.
Right. Awareness is key. But what about concrete actions? Are there any specific initiatives or proposals that are gaining traction?
One promising development is the increasing support for extending the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act to MMA.
That would be a
Yeah.
huge win for the fighters. But what are the chances of that actually happening?
It's hard to say for sure. There's still some resistance from the UFC and others, but the momentum seems to be building. More and more lawmakers are recognizing the need for reform.
Fingers crossed. Another potential solution we talked about was the formation of a fighters union. What's the latest on that front? Are fighters making any progress towards organizing?
There have been some efforts to organize fighters, but it's a slow and challenging process.
I can imagine. As we discussed earlier, there are a lot of hurdles to overcome. The legal status of fighters, the diversity of the athlete pool, the UFC's opposition. It's a tough battle.
It is, but there are some dedicated individuals and groups working tirelessly to make it happen.
I admire their persistence. It's
Yeah.
inspiring to see people fighting for what they believe in, even when the odds are stacked against them.
And don't underestimate the power of public pressure. The more attention these issues receive, the more likely it is that things will change.
Right. The court of public opinion can be a powerful force.
It can.
It can sway politicians, influence corporate decisions, and even shame bad actors into doing the right thing.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to keep the conversation going, to educate people about the issues, to amplify the voices of the fighters, and to demand better from those in power.
Okay, so we've got the Ali Act, a fighters union. What about this idea of a UFC Fighters Council? Is that gaining any traction?
There's definitely been some discussion about it, but it's unclear how much support it has within the UFC itself.
It's one thing for fighters to want it, but it's another thing for the UFC to actually implement it.
Right. It would require a significant shift in their approach. They would have to be willing to cede some control and give fighters a genuine voice in the decision-making process.
Which let's be honest, might not be their top priority. But
Yep.
hey, maybe they'll surprise us. Maybe they'll realize that empowering fighters is actually in their best interest in the long run.
It's certainly possible. After all, happy and well-compensated athletes tend to perform better and generate more excitement for the sport.
It's a win-win situation. So let's say hypothetically that the UFC decides to embrace some of these solutions. They extend the Ali Act to MMA. They create a fighters council. They start paying fighters a bigger share of the revenue. What would that look like? What kind of impact would that have on the sport?
Well, for starters, it would likely lead to a more level playing field. Fighters would have more bargaining power, more control over their careers, and more financial security.
That would be a game changer.
Yeah.
It would transform the entire ecosystem of MMA.
It would. It would also likely lead to a more competitive landscape. If fighters are free to negotiate with other organizations, it could give rise to new MMA promotions challenging the UFC's dominance.
More competition would be great for the sport. It would force the UFC to step up their game and treat fighters better if they want to retain the top talent.
It would. It would be a more dynamic and unpredictable environment, which is always good for fans.
And it could lead to even more innovation in the sport. New fighting styles, new strategies, new personalities. The possibilities are endless.
It's exciting to think about, but even if those big structural changes don't happen overnight, there are still things that can be done to improve the lives of fighters.
Like what? What are some smaller, more incremental steps that could be taken?
Well, one idea is to create a more transparent system for determining fighter pay. Right now, it's a bit of black box.
So it's like they're just being handed a paycheck without any real understanding of how they earned it.
Exactly, and that lack of transparency breeds distrust and resentment.
It's like working for a company that refuses to tell you how your salary is determined. You're just supposed to trust that they're being fair.
And that's not a sustainable model. So one solution would be to create a more open and transparent system, perhaps a standardized pay scale based on factors like experience, wins, losses, and rankings.
That would make a lot of sense. It would level the playing field and ensure that that fighters are compensated fairly for their accomplishments.
Another idea is to establish an independent body to oversee contract negotiations.
So like a neutral third party that can mediate between fighters and the UFC and ensure that everyone's getting a fair deal.
Exactly. It would help to eliminate the power imbalance that currently exists and protect fighters from exploitative contracts.
I like that idea. It's all about checks and balances,
Yeah.
right? Making sure that no one entity has too much power.
Absolutely, and it's about creating a more professional and ethical environment for the sport, one where fighters are treated with respect and compensated fairly for the risks they take.
Okay, so we've got some potential solutions on the table, both big and small. But I'm curious to know your thoughts on this whole situation. As someone who has studied this issue in depth, what are your hopes for the future of MMA? Do you think things will get better for fighters?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think the awareness of these issues is growing,
Yeah.
and there's a real desire for change, both within the MMA community and among the general public. The Zuffa lawsuit, regardless of its outcome,
Mhm.
has been a catalyst for important conversations.
It's like a wake up call for the entire sport.
Exactly, and I think the UFC is feeling the pressure. They're starting to realize that they need to address these issues if they want to maintain their reputation and continue to grow.
So you're saying that there's a chance,
Correct.
a real chance that things could change for the better.
I believe there is,
Yeah.
but it's going to take a collective effort. Fighters need to continue to speak out and advocate for their rights. Fans need to hold the UFC accountable and demand fair treatment for athletes, and lawmakers need to step in and create a more equitable legal framework for the sport.
It's a team effort. Everyone needs to play their part.
Exactly, and if we all work together, I think we can create a future for MMA where fighters are valued, respected, and compensated fairly for the sacrifices they make.
I love that vision.
Yeah.
A future where MMA is not only the most exciting sport in the world, but also one of the uh, most ethical and equitable.
That's the goal, and I believe it's achievable,
Yeah.
but we need to keep pushing for progress
Yeah.
to never stop fighting for what's right.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to take another short break. We'll be right back to discuss some of the research on UFC marketing and the fascinating strategies they use to build hype and engage fans.
Hmm.
And we're back. Welcome back to the MMA Scholar podcast. You know, we've been talking about the business side of MMA.
It's a fascinating world, that's for sure.
It is full of drama and intrigue.
And let's not forget a whole lot of money.
Oh yeah, big money. But you know, amidst all the glitz and glamour, it's easy to forget about the fighters themselves.
Right, the ones who are actually, putting their bodies on the line.
Exactly, and that's why we've been diving deep into some of the challenges they face. You know, like fighter pay and the UFC's market dominance.
It's a complex landscape for sure.
It is, but we've also been exploring some potential solutions, right?
Hmm.
Like extending the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act to MMA.
Right, or creating a fighters union.
Yeah, those are big ideas that could really shake things up.
They could fundamentally change the power dynamics in the sport.
And for the better, hopefully.
Yeah.
You know, giving fighters more control over their careers and ensuring that they're compensated fairly for the risks they take.
That's the goal.
It is. But you know, while we're waiting for those big changes to happen, what about some smaller, more incremental steps? What can be done right now to improve the lives of fighters?
Well, one important step would be to create a more transparent system for determining fighter pay.
Yeah, right now it's like a black box, isn't it?
It is. Fighters often don't know how their pay is calculated.
And that can lead to a lot of mistrust and resentment.
It can, and it's not a healthy situation for anyone involved.
So how do we fix that? How do we make the pay system more transparent?
Well, one option would be to establish a standardized pay scale. You
Yeah.
know, based on factors like experience, wins, losses, and rankings.
So like a clear set of criteria that everyone understands and agrees on.
Exactly. It would provide a more objective framework for determining fighter pay, reducing the potential for bias or unfairness.
I like that. It takes the guesswork out of it.
It would. And another step would be to establish an independent body to oversee contract negotiations.
So like a neutral third party
Exact.
to make sure that everything's above board.
Right. This independent body could mediate between fighters and the UFC
Okay.
review contracts to ensure they're fair and reasonable and provide guidance and support to fighters during the negotiation process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It levels the playing field a bit.
It does. It gives fighters a stronger voice in the process.
And it protects them from from being taken advantage of.
That's right. Which is essential.
Absolutely. So, we've been talking about all these potential solutions, but I'm curious, do you really think the UFC will ever embrace these ideas? I mean, they've been pretty resistant to change in the past
Well, I think the pressure is mounting
from fighters,
from fans.
from all sides.
So they're starting to feel the heat.
They are, and I think they're realizing that they can't ignore these issues forever.
Because it's bad for their image.
It is. It's bad for business.
Makes sense. So there's hope then
I believe there is.
that the UFC will eventually do the right thing
Yeah, but it's going to take a collective effort.
from everyone involved.
Fighters, fans, journalists, lawmakers, we all need to keep pushing for a more equitable and sustainable future for MMA.
I agree.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
Yeah, I think so too.
This has been an incredible deep dive into the world of MMA.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground.
We talked about fighter pay, the UFC's market dominance, the potential for change, the need for greater transparency and fairness.
And I think we've come away with a better understanding of the complexities of this fascinating sport.
I know I have. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this intellectual journey.
We appreciate you tuning in.
And remember, keep those brains working just as hard as those bodies in the octagon. Until next time, fight fans.
Stay curious.